If you happen to be listening tonight from somewhere quiet, perhaps a dim room, perhaps a long highway, or perhaps your bed, while the rest of the world slowly forgets the day, you're very welcome here. And before we begin wandering anywhere together tonight, I always like to ask a small favor, the gentle kind that can be ignored without guilt. If you enjoy slow historical stories like this one, you might consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. And sometimes I'm curious where everyone is listening from. Some people listen in the middle of the afternoon, some in the deep hours after midnight, some during long train rides. So if you feel like it, tell me where you are and what time it is where you live, but only if you want to. Now, let us step into a city that has not quite woken yet. Not completely. The sky is still undecided. There is a thin grey light hovering behind the rooftops, the sort of light that does not illuminate anything clearly, but quietly suggests that the night is slowly losing its argument with the morning. In medieval towns, this particular moment had a strange importance, because for most people, this was when the market began, not officially, not formally, but practically, which is a very medieval distinction. Official things often happened later. Practical things happened first. And markets were deeply practical. They were practical in the way hunger is practical, or milk going sour, or fish beginning to smell like something that should have been eaten yesterday. So the market began early, not because anyone designed it that way, but because time and decay and flies and impatient cooks all quietly insisted. The funny thing is that nobody ever really decided this. There was no council meeting where someone stood up and said, "Let us all meet at dawn to sell onions." It happened slowly, almost accidentally. Farmers arrived early because they had walked half the night. Fish sellers arrived early because fish behaves badly in sunlight. Milk sellers arrived early because milk behaves badly in existence. And then customers arrived early because the good food vanished early. And once everyone noticed this, it became normal, which is often how medieval systems were created, not by design, but by inconvenience. Now imagine the streets before this quiet ritual begins. The city gates may have only just opened. In some towns they were locked all night, not because anyone expected an army, but because medieval authorities had a deep love for closing things. Gates, taverns, city walls, conversations. Even the night itself had a bell, the curfew bell. Once it rang, respectable people were supposed to disappear indoors. So when the gates opened in the grey morning, the roads outside them often looked slightly ridiculous. Carts waiting, farmers half asleep, a goat tied to a wheel, two geese arguing with each other for reasons only geese understand, and everyone pretending they had been there for only a moment, not 3 hours, because arriving early had advantages, very quiet advantages. You see, the market inside the town square had rules. Official spaces, official stalls, official taxes, but the road outside the gate was not quite the market yet, which meant interesting things could happen there. For example, someone might meet a farmer carrying a cart full of onions, and someone else might say, "Those onions look very fine," and the farmer might say, "They are," and then perhaps, purely by coincidence, the entire cart of onions might be purchased before the farmer ever entered the city, which meant the onions never reached the market, which meant later that morning someone could sell those onions inside the market for more money. This little trick was called forestalling, and medieval governments hated it, not because it was dishonest, but because it interfered with taxes. Markets were very useful things for cities. They created food supply, noise, crowds, commerce, but most importantly, they created fees. Stall fees, weighing fees, market dues, toll gates, little payments that seemed small until you realized the entire town paid them. So when merchants bought goods before they reached the market, the city earned nothing, which was rude, and medieval law had a particular dislike for rudeness that cost money. But of course, laws are one thing, morning fog is another, because dawn markets always existed in that strange half-legal moment, too early for officials, too early for inspections, too early for rules to wake up properly, which meant the first people inside the square were not always the official ones. They were the practical ones, the ones with carts, or baskets, or barrels, and slowly, very slowly, the market assembled itself, not all at once. Markets never appeared like organized events. They accumulated, first one cart, then another, then someone dragging a trestle table across cobblestones, then someone hammering two wooden pegs into the ground to tie a cloth roof, then someone swearing loudly because the ground was uneven, which it always was. Medieval streets were not polite surfaces. They were damp and muddy, and deeply committed to remaining that way. So the first stall of the morning often began with a small engineering problem. How do you balance a wooden table on ground that behaves like soup? The solution was rarely elegant. A stone under one leg, a broken brick under another, sometimes a shoe, sometimes a cabbage. Temporary solutions, which is another thing medieval markets loved. Temporary solutions that lasted 300 years. Because once a stall stood in the same place long enough, it quietly became that person's spot, not legally, but socially. And medieval society was extremely serious about social habits. If a fish seller had stood in that exact corner every market day for 20 years, then that corner slowly belonged to the fish seller, not officially, but everyone knew, which meant that when a new merchant arrived and placed his cart there, the morning could become surprisingly dramatic, not with violence. Medieval people were busy, but with complaints. Complaints were a highly developed medieval technology, and complaints at dawn were especially loud, because by this time the smells had begun. Markets at sunrise were not quiet environments. They were sensory experiments. Let us begin with fish. Fish always arrived early. Fish had urgency. Fish was a creature that demanded respect, because a fish that was fresh at sunrise could be suspicious by midday and criminal by afternoon. So fish sellers moved quickly. Barrels opened. Ice, if there was any, melted into thin grey water, and the smell appeared, not immediately. At first it was faint, a salty dampness, a suggestion of river mud. But markets are crowded places, and smells behave like gossip. They spread quickly. Soon the smell of fish mixed with other smells, the smell of straw, the smell of horses, the smell of damp wool cloaks that had travelled half the countryside, and somewhere, very quietly, the smell of onions, because onions were everywhere, not glamorous, not exciting, but persistent. Medieval cooking loved onions in the same way medieval streets loved mud, constantly, And now that the first sellers had arrived, another sound joined the market. Voices. Not normal voices. Market voices, which are a special category of human sound. Because market sellers did not merely speak, they announced, they performed, they sang prices the way birds sing territory. Fresh fish, best onions, milk this morning, bread still warm. Of course, none of these claims were entirely reliable. Bread was often warm, but sometimes yesterday's bread was warmed again. Milk was often fresh, but sometimes it was, diplomatically speaking, optimistic. And onions were always good, because onions forgive many things. But the most interesting thing about these cries is that nobody ever organized them. There was no meeting where sellers agreed how loud a carrot should be advertised. It simply happened. The loudest voices sold more goods. So voices became louder, until eventually the market sounded like a small argument between 200 people, and the sun had not even fully risen yet. Meanwhile, official people were beginning to appear. Inspectors, town officers, men who carried scales, which meant the morning was about to become slightly more honest, or at least more careful. Because medieval markets had rules about weights, bread had to weigh a certain amount, ale had to cost a certain price, fish could not be entirely imaginary. These rules existed partly to protect customers, but also to produce fines, and fines were extremely popular with town governments. So sellers learned interesting habits. Scales were adjusted, weights were polished, good bread sat at the front of the stall, and the questionable bread sat politely behind it. Which brings us to a quiet truth about medieval markets. Everyone cheated a little, not dramatically, not heroically, but creatively. A basket might have a false bottom. A sack might contain more straw than cabbage. A fish might be displayed with its best side facing the customer. Human beings are remarkably consistent across centuries. But the strange part is this: these little tricks did not destroy the market. They became part of it because customers expected them, and inspectors expected them, and sellers expected customers to expect them, which meant the entire system balanced itself somewhere between honesty and theatrical dishonesty. And this balance, strangely enough, worked for centuries, all beginning in the grey hour before sunrise. If you had walked into a medieval market square just before sunrise, before the crowds truly thickened, before the sun climbed high enough to warm the stones, you might have noticed something curious. The smell arrived before the market did, not loudly, not dramatically, but gradually, the way fog enters a valley. Because markets were not only places where goods were sold, they were places where everything living left a trace. And traces have smells. The first smell usually came with the animals, not the animals for sale yet. Those arrived later. These were the animals that carried the market itself. Donkeys with sacks of grain, small horses pulling two-wheeled carts. Occasionally, a stubborn ox that had been convinced, with varying success, that walking into town was a good idea. Animals are honest creatures. They express their opinions immediately, and one of the ways they do that is by leaving things behind. So the first layer of a dawn market was often a quiet scattering of straw and droppings across the cobblestones. Nothing unusual, just the practical consequences of transportation. A farmer might step down from his cart, stretch his back, and begin unloading baskets of cabbages. And the cabbages themselves had a smell. Not unpleasant, but earthy, damp soil clinging to their roots, morning dew still resting on the leaves. If you stood nearby long enough, you could almost imagine the field they had come from, the damp ground, the quiet rows, the long night journey into the city. But before that gentle smell could settle, another one arrived. Fish. Fish never waited politely. Fish announced themselves. A barrel lid would lift, water would splash onto the stones, and suddenly the air changed. It was not exactly rotten, not yet. Fresh fish smells more like the memory of the sea. Salt, river mud, a little cold iron. But the problem with fish is not the beginning of the smell. It is the future of the smell, because everyone in the market understood a simple truth. Fish is a creature that behaves well for a very short period of time. Then it becomes complicated. So fish sellers moved quickly. They arranged their fish with great seriousness. Large fish at the back, smaller fish at the front, shiny ones displayed carefully so the scales caught the weak morning light. And sometimes, if the fish had lived a slightly longer life than the seller preferred, the fish might be placed in a position that showed its most optimistic angle. Markets are full of optimism, particularly visual optimism, but fish were only the second layer of the morning smell. The third layer came from something more dramatic. Butchers. Butchers rarely arrived quietly. They had carts, heavy carts, and heavy carts do not whisper across cobblestones. They rattle, they scrape, they complain. Sometimes the butcher had already slaughtered the animal outside the city. Sometimes the animal arrived alive. Both situations had their own sensory consequences. If the meat was already prepared, there was the smell of fresh blood, warm, metallic, mixed with the slightly sweet scent of animal fat. But if the animal arrived alive, then the market experienced a brief moment of negotiation. Animals often sense the intentions of butchers, and animals rarely approved of those intentions. So occasionally, the calm rhythm of the early market would be interrupted by a pig expressing deep philosophical disagreement, or a sheep attempting to reverse direction, or a chicken achieving temporary flight. Medieval markets were not quiet environments, but strangely enough, people barely noticed these things because they were normal. Noise, smell, movement. These were not disturbances. They were simply evidence that the market was alive. And as more sellers arrived, the smells layered themselves together. Milk sellers came next. Milk was carried in wooden pails. Wooden pails are very good containers, but they are not perfect containers, especially when milk has traveled a long distance over uneven roads. So the smell of milk in a dawn market was never purely sweet. It was warm, slightly sour, mixed with damp wood, and occasionally the faint smell of a cow that had been much closer to the container earlier in the morning. Milk had urgency too, perhaps even more urgency than fish, because milk was extremely confident in its ability to become cheese, whether anyone asked it to or not. So dairy sellers were quick. They poured, they measured, they argued about prices, and sometimes they quietly diluted the milk with a little water. Not much, just enough to make the day feel slightly more profitable. Everyone knew this happened. Customers suspected it. Inspectors suspected it. The water suspected it. But the system continued because medieval markets were built on a shared understanding, a kind of silent agreement that perfection was unrealistic. Honesty was ideal, but survival was practical, and markets were practical places. Now, by this time, the sun had begun to rise properly. Light slipped between the rooftops. The stone walls warmed slightly, and with warmth came a new development. Flies. Flies loved markets. They adored markets. To a fly, a medieval market was essentially a festival. Fish, meat, milk, straw, horses, humans, everything a fly could possibly hope for. So by mid-morning, the air began to vibrate with quiet wings, not overwhelming, just present, and sellers developed their own techniques for managing them. A cloth waved lazily, a hand brushed across the counter. A cat wandered through the stalls with professional curiosity. Cats were extremely popular in markets. They performed many useful services. They hunted mice. They chased birds. And occasionally they stole fish, which was technically against the rules, but morally understandable. Meanwhile, somewhere near the center of the square, another smell had begun forming. This smell was not attached to a particular stall. It belonged to the market itself. A mixture, the accumulation of everything that had happened that morning: spilled ale, dropped cabbage leaves, a crushed onion under someone's boot, water from fish barrels flowing slowly along the street, straw soaked with milk, animal droppings politely ignored by passing carts. All of these things blended together into a scent that was unmistakably market. And medieval people knew this smell well. It was the smell of food arriving, of work beginning, of the city waking up. But it was also the smell that caused problems, because cities did not always appreciate it. Town councils were deeply aware that markets smelled enthusiastic, and enthusiasm in large quantities can become a public complaint. So regulations appeared. Rules about where butchers could stand, rules about where fish could be cleaned, rules about where waste should be thrown, and the rules sounded very reasonable until human behavior entered the conversation. Because rules are written on paper, markets happen on streets, and streets are messy. If a rule said fish guts must be thrown into the river, then someone had to carry them there, which required time and walking and effort. So occasionally, fish guts travelled only part of the journey, perhaps into a nearby alley, or beneath a cart, or into a convenient corner where nobody was currently looking, which meant the smell moved. Instead of disappearing, cities solved this problem repeatedly, and unsuccessfully, for centuries, because the market always returned the next morning with the same carts, the same fish, the same milk, and often the same onion seller who had been standing in the same spot for 20 years. By now the square was almost full. Voices rose, coins changed hands, children ran between stalls. Someone argued loudly about the price of eggs. Someone else accused a butcher of cutting meat slightly too generously toward himself. And above all of this, the smell continued drifting through the air. Persistent, complex, alive. The smell of a city feeding itself. If the smell of a medieval market arrived first, the sound was never far behind. Not immediately. At the very beginning of the morning, there were only small noises, the quiet ones. A wooden wheel shifting on stone, a rope pulled tight around a post, the dull thud of a basket placed on the ground. These are not dramatic sounds. They are the sounds of preparation, And preparation has a very particular rhythm. People do not hurry loudly when they first arrive. They move carefully, stretching stiff backs, checking their goods, looking around the square to see who else has arrived early, because early arrival had its own kind of competition. Not an official competition, but a social one. The first seller to begin shouting prices often gained attention, and attention in a market was almost a form of currency, but nobody wanted to be the very first voice. That would feel strange, a little desperate, so everyone waited a moment, a short pause in the half-light, until eventually someone decided the silence had lasted long enough. It was usually the fish seller. Fish sellers had a sense of urgency about them. They understood the relationship between time and profit better than most. Fish was polite only for a few hours. Then it began developing personality. So somewhere across the square, a voice would rise. Fresh fish this morning. It would echo softly between the stone walls. A confident voice, but not too loud. Not yet, because shouting at an empty market would be embarrassing. But that single call had a curious effect. It gave permission. Suddenly, another voice answered, "Milk, fresh milk." Then another, "Bread, still warm." And before long, the quiet morning air had transformed into something else entirely. A conversation. Not an organized conversation, more like several hundred conversations happening simultaneously, which is exactly what it was. Customers began arriving in small groups. A servant sent from a household kitchen, a cook from a nearby tavern, a pair of laborers who planned to buy bread before beginning the day's work. And as customers appeared, the voices changed. Sellers did not simply repeat the same call again and again. That would be boring. Markets rewarded creativity, so sellers developed styles. Some sellers sang their prices. Some sellers shouted them like soldiers giving orders. Some sellers spoke quickly, rattling off offers in a stream of words that sounded convincing even when nobody quite understood them. And occasionally, a seller developed a call so distinctive that regular customers recognized it instantly. A particular rhythm, a particular melody, almost like a bird announcing territory. These calls became part of the city itself. People walking through the streets could identify the market without seeing it. They heard it first. But the interesting thing about these market cries is that nobody designed them. There was no official handbook, no guild rule explaining the proper tone for selling onions. It was pure improvisation, human voices adapting to competition. If a seller shouted louder, others responded. If someone developed a clever phrase, others copied it. And over time, the market developed its own language, a language made of prices, exaggerations, jokes, and complaints. Complaints were especially popular because complaints attract attention. A seller might shout, "These eggs are cheaper than the butcher's lies," which forced the butcher to reply, "Better eggs than your milk, which has met more water than a sailor." The crowd enjoyed these exchanges. Markets were places of trade, but they were also places of entertainment. And entertainment sells goods. So arguments became performances, not real anger, more like theatrical irritation. But every now and then, the irritation was genuine, because medieval markets contain something that always creates tension: space, or rather, the lack of it. Remember those temporary stall solutions from earlier? The stones under table legs, the borrowed corner of the square, the spot someone had used for 20 years. These arrangements worked well until someone new arrived. and new sellers arrived constantly. A farmer with extra apples, a traveler with cloth, a widow selling herbs, someone looking for opportunity. And sometimes that opportunity happened to be exactly where another seller believed his stall belonged. At first, the disagreement was quiet, a suggestion, a polite reminder. You may not have noticed, but this space is usually mine. But if the newcomer disagreed, the conversation could grow louder, not violent, but loud, voices rising, arms waving, neighbors offering opinions nobody asked for. Eventually, someone might suggest calling an official, which meant the arrival of a man who carried two things: authority and a very tired expression. Market officials had difficult mornings. They were responsible for order in a place designed almost entirely around disorder. Their duties included checking weights, inspecting bread, watching for stolen goods, stopping fights, and occasionally deciding whether a cabbage seller had stood 2 feet too far to the left. None of these decisions made them popular, but they were necessary because markets had rules, very specific rules. Bread had to weigh the correct amount. Ale had to cost the correct price. Fish could not be too old. Scales had to be honest, which sounds simple, until you remember that medieval people were remarkably inventive, especially when small profits were involved. A scale weight might be shaved slightly thinner. A measuring cup might have a subtle dent in its base. A basket might be filled with apples, arranged very carefully so the best ones sat on top. This was not considered outrageous behavior. It was considered business. Customers understood this, which is why customers inspected goods with great seriousness, turning fruit over, pressing bread, smelling fish, sometimes even arguing over a single coin, a coin that might represent an entire hour of labor. Markets were full of these tiny negotiations, thousands of them every morning, each one brief, each one important, and all of them happening while the noise continued rising. Children ran through the crowd, dogs barked, a cartwheel struck a stone and produced a loud crack. A rooster, someone had brought a rooster for sale, decided this was the correct moment to greet the sun. And somewhere, very quietly, a thief was working, because markets had another feature: crowds, and crowds create opportunity. Not for merchants, for pickpockets. The early hours of the market were perfect for this profession. People carried money. They were distracted. They were busy arguing about vegetables, and the sound of the market helped. Noise hides small movements. A hand sliding into a pouch, a knife cutting a purse string, a body moving gently through the crowd. Sometimes the thief succeeded. Sometimes the victim noticed. And when that happened, the sound of the market changed again, because nothing travels faster through a medieval crowd than the word thief. Suddenly, voices shifted. People turned. Someone pointed. Someone else grabbed the wrong person entirely, and the market official returned with his tired expression. Order would eventually return. It always did, because markets were stubborn. They had existed for centuries, and they had learned something important. Human beings are noisy creatures. If you bring enough of them together in one place, noise becomes inevitable. But noise also becomes useful, because noise means life, trade, food, coin, conversation. The city feeding itself one morning at a time, and as the sun climbed higher, the market continued speaking in hundreds of voices. none of them organized, all of them necessary. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to touch the tops of the buildings, the market had reached a very particular stage of the morning. Not the quiet stage, that was long gone, and not yet the chaotic midday rush either. This was the middle rhythm, the moment when the market had fully awakened, but had not yet grown tired. And this was also the moment when the small tricks began, not the dramatic kind. Medieval markets did not rely on elaborate criminal schemes. Most of the tricks were small, almost polite, tiny adjustments to reality. Because the truth is, everyone in the market knew that business required a certain flexibility, a certain creativity. Take baskets, for example. Baskets were everywhere. Baskets of apples, baskets of onions, baskets of herbs, baskets of eggs balanced carefully on straw. Baskets are wonderful inventions. Light, portable, easy to carry across long distances. But baskets also have an interesting property. Their bottoms are rarely examined very closely. And so, over the centuries, some baskets developed a quiet improvement. A false bottom, not a dramatic false bottom, just a small layer of woven reeds placed slightly higher than necessary, enough to make the basket appear full, while the actual contents politely remained smaller. Customers suspected this. Of course they did, but suspicion is a complicated emotion. If the apples on top looked good and the price was acceptable, most customers simply accepted the illusion, which meant the trick worked. Not perfectly, but often enough. And when a customer complained, the seller had an answer ready. Ah, you see, the apples settled during the journey. Apples are blamed for many things. Now another common trick involved something far more serious. Weights. Markets depended on scales. Two small metal plates, a beam, and a collection of metal weights. In theory, this system was perfectly fair, but theory and practice rarely travel together. Metal weights could be filed down, only slightly, just enough to remove a thin shaving, not enough to be obvious, but enough to create a small advantage. If a butcher sold 50 cuts of meat that morning, each one weighed with a slightly dishonest weight, the profit quietly accumulated. Inspectors knew this, which is why they often carried their own weights. And when an inspector approached a stall, the seller suddenly became very interested in rearranging his goods. Scales were wiped, weights were polished. Everything looked extremely honest. This dance between sellers and inspectors happened every market day, a kind of quiet theatre, neither side completely surprised by the other, because the truth was simple. Inspectors wanted to catch dishonesty, but not all dishonesty. If they caught too many sellers, the market would become unhappy, and unhappy markets cause political problems. So, inspections were selective, occasional, just enough to remind everyone that rules existed, but not enough to stop business entirely. And business, after all, was the real purpose of the market. Now there was another trick that happened before the market even began. You may remember it from earlier. A curious little habit called forestalling. This trick did not occur inside the market. It happened outside the city gates, or along the roads leading into town. Imagine a farmer walking toward the market at dawn, a cart full of vegetables, cabbages, turnips, perhaps a sack of beans. He plans to sell them inside the market square, but halfway along the road, someone meets him. A merchant, friendly, interested, and the merchant says something very simple. I will buy everything you have, immediately. No waiting, No shouting in the market, no arguing over prices, just one payment. And the farmer considers this because markets are uncertain places. Prices change. Goods might not sell, time might be wasted, but this merchant is offering certainty, so the farmer agrees. The cart changes ownership, and the merchant enters the city with vegetables that were never technically sold in the market. Later that morning, those same vegetables appear on a stall for a higher price. Customers complain, authorities complain, but proving forestalling is difficult because conversations on country roads rarely have witnesses, and medieval law struggled with invisible conversations. So the practice continued, again and again, for centuries. But perhaps the most entertaining tricks involved something even simpler. Presentation. Presentation is powerful, even in a medieval market, especially in a medieval market. Imagine a stall of apples. On the top layer, beautiful apples, round, shiny, perfectly red. Below them, less enthusiastic apples, slightly bruised, a little soft, still edible, but not impressive. Customers knew this system, which is why customers often insisted on reaching deeper into the basket, and sellers hated this. Because the deeper apples were not intended for immediate inspection, they were part of the illusion. So sellers developed techniques, a quick hand, a subtle movement, replacing a questionable apple with a better one before the customer noticed. It was almost a magic trick, and occasionally it worked. But customers also had their own tricks. Customers squeezed fruit. Customers smelled fish. Customers weighed bread in their hands with surprising accuracy. Years of experience had trained them well, which meant the market became a place where everyone watched everyone else. A continuous negotiation of trust. Now, there was one final trick worth mentioning, and it involved something surprisingly ordinary. Water. Water appeared in many places in a medieval market. Fish barrels contained water. Milk sometimes contained water. Vegetables were sprinkled with water to keep them fresh. But water also had another use. Weight. If a sack of grain absorbed a little moisture overnight, it weighed more. If fish were dipped in water before being placed on the scale, they weighed more. If cloth was stored in a damp place, it weighed more. None of these tricks were dramatic, just small adjustments, small advantages, small profits. But when repeated hundreds of times across hundreds of markets, they became part of the economic system, which is why medieval authorities spent centuries writing rules about trade, and why those rules rarely solved the problem completely. Because markets were not machines, they were human gatherings, and humans have always been creative when coins are involved. Still, despite all these tricks, people kept coming every morning because the market worked. Not perfectly, but well enough. Food arrived, coins changed hands. The city survived another day, and tomorrow morning the same tricks would return, perhaps slightly improved, perhaps slightly different, but always familiar. If you stood quietly in a medieval market long enough, you would eventually notice something interesting. The market was not only a place where food appeared, it was also a place where people appeared, and they did not all arrive at the same time. The market had its own quiet schedule of human activity, not written anywhere, not organized by any authority, but remarkably consistent. The first people to arrive were rarely the ones you might expect. They were not wealthy merchants, not important officials, and not even the farmers who brought carts of vegetables. The very first buyers were usually servants, kitchen servants, young boys or girls sent out from houses that still slept in darkness. Large medieval households woke early. Bread had to be prepared. Stews had to begin simmering. Ale had to be warmed. And someone needed to buy the ingredients. So servants arrived carrying baskets. Sometimes wooden baskets. Sometimes cloth sacks. And sometimes a small purse tied carefully to a belt. The purse was watched very carefully, because losing household money was a career-ending mistake. Servants moved quickly. They knew exactly what they needed. Milk, eggs, bread, sometimes herbs, occasionally a piece of meat if the household was prosperous. They did not wander slowly through the market like curious visitors. They negotiated quickly, because the cook was waiting, and cooks were not famous for patience. If the servant returned late, breakfast might be delayed, which meant the master of the house became irritated, which meant the cook became irritated, which meant the servant's morning became complicated. So the servant bought quickly. But even quick buyers could not escape the personality of the market. A seller might try a joke. "Ah, buying milk again. Your master must drink like a cow." The servant might roll their eyes, because this joke had probably been told every market day for 10 years. Markets repeat themselves, humor included. Now, after the servants came another group, the cooks themselves. Not all households sent servants. Some cooks preferred to inspect food personally, because cooks had strong opinions, especially about fish. Fish was a delicate subject in medieval kitchens. A fish that smelled suspicious could ruin an entire meal. And if a meal was ruined, someone was blamed, usually the cook. So cooks arrived in the market with serious expressions. They examined fish with impressive focus. They lifted gills, pressed flesh, smelled carefully. Fish sellers disliked this. Because professional cooks were difficult customers, they knew too much, but refusing them was impossible. A cook who trusted your stall might return every week, which was valuable. Now, by this time, the market square had begun filling more noticeably. The sun climbed higher, light spilled across the stone buildings, and the third wave of people arrived. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, leather workers, men whose workshops would soon open. They stopped at the market before beginning the day's labor, usually buying bread, sometimes cheese, occasionally onions. Onions were extremely popular among working people. Cheap, strong, reliable, they improved almost any meal. Craftsmen did not linger long. Work waited, but they brought something useful to the market. Conversations. Craftsmen enjoyed discussing news. Who had been arrested? Which road was dangerous? Which merchant had cheated someone? Markets were excellent places for information. News traveled through markets faster than through official announcements, and sometimes the news was even correct. Now, not everyone in the market had come to buy food. Some people came for different reasons entirely. Take beggars. Markets were excellent locations for begging. Crowds meant opportunity, and the morning crowd was particularly promising. People arriving early were often in good moods. They had not yet experienced the frustrations of the day, which made them more generous. So, beggars positioned themselves carefully, near the entrance, near the bread stalls, near the busiest paths. They spoke softly, or sometimes loudly, explaining their misfortune to anyone who would listen. Some stories were true, some stories were creative, but both varieties could earn a coin, and coins were survival. Now there was another group who also appreciated crowds. Children, markets fascinated children, bright vegetables, moving animals, strange smells, loud voices. A market was essentially a festival of curiosity. Children ran between stalls, chased chickens, watched butchers with fascinated horror, and occasionally stole apples. Not large thefts, just small adventures. An apple taken quickly from a basket, a quick bite, then disappearance into the crowd. Sellers noticed this. Of course they did, but chasing children through a crowded market was rarely worth the effort. So many sellers accepted a certain level of apple disappearance as part of the mourning. Now, among all these ordinary people, there were also less obvious visitors, people who did not intend to buy anything or sell anything, but were simply waiting, watching, learning. One example was the pickpocket. Pickpockets rarely rushed their work. They observed, studied movement, watched for heavy purses. Markets provided perfect camouflage. Everyone was distracted. Everyone was focused on food, which meant careful hands could move quietly through the crowd, not always successfully. Sometimes a purse string snapped too loudly. Sometimes a victim noticed. And then the cry rose, "Thief," which caused immediate excitement. Crowds turned. People pointed. Someone grabbed the wrong person, and a market official arrived again with that familiar, exhausted expression. But even this chaos eventually settled, because markets were surprisingly resilient places. Life continued. Coins continued to change hands. Bread continued to sell. And somewhere in the square, an onion seller continued standing in exactly the same place he had occupied for 20 years, watching all these people come and go, servants, cooks, craftsmen, beggars, children, thieves, all part of the same morning ritual, a ritual repeated hundreds of times every year. And every morning, the market began again. If you walked through a medieval market square on a random morning, nothing about the layout would look particularly organized. Stalls appeared where they happened to fit. Tables leaned slightly to one side. Carts stopped wherever the wheels finally decided to stop. There were no painted lines on the ground, no assigned numbers, no tidy rows like a modern marketplace. At first glance, the entire place looked accidental, and in the beginning, it actually was. The earliest markets rarely started with careful planning. People simply arrived. They set down their goods. They began selling. If a corner of the square had enough space for a cart, someone used it. If a wall offered shelter from the wind, someone leaned a stall against it. If a patch of ground was dry, someone claimed it. These were temporary decisions. At least that was the intention. Just for today. Just for this market day. But temporary decisions have a curious habit. If they work well, people repeat them. The fish seller returns to the same spot because customers remember where he stands. The bread seller prefers the same corner because the morning sun warms the stall. The herb seller chooses a place near the well because people passing by often stop to buy something small. And slowly, the temporary arrangement begins repeating itself. Week after week, month after month, year after year, until eventually something strange happens. People begin speaking about that place in a new way, not as a place, but as his place, or her place, the butcher's corner, the onion seller's spot, the fish stall beside the fountain. No law had created these claims. No official map recorded them. But social memory is powerful. Everyone knew where everyone usually stood, and that knowledge quietly hardened into tradition, which meant that if someone new arrived and chose the same space, the morning could become interesting. At first, the disagreement sounded polite, very polite. "Good morning. I believe this space is normally occupied." The newcomer might smile. "It seems empty today." "Yes," the regular seller might reply, "but it will not remain empty." And then both of them would stand there, looking at the same patch of ground, waiting, because markets are full of witnesses. Other sellers watched with quiet interest. Customers paused nearby. Arguments about space were extremely entertaining, not violent, but theatrical, because both people believed they were correct. The regular seller believed in tradition. The newcomer believed in opportunity. Both arguments had logic, which meant someone else would eventually be involved. An official. Market officials spent a surprising amount of time solving these problems. Because once traditions become expectations, violating them feels like theft, even if the law has never mentioned the matter. Now, sometimes the official made a simple decision. You stand there today, he stands here. But other times the situation was more complicated, because some places in the market had become valuable, very valuable. A stall near the entrance saw more customers. A stall beside the well had constant traffic. A stall near the bread cellar attracted hungry people. These spots were prime territory, which meant the city noticed, and when cities notice valuable things, they invent taxes. So gradually the idea of stall fees appeared. If a seller wanted to stand in a particular location, the seller paid a small amount of money. This fee had a name, stallage, a very practical word for a very practical concept. You pay, you stand. Simple. But simplicity rarely survives contact with human behavior, because once stallage existed, people began protecting their spots even more fiercely. A stall was no longer just a habit, it was an investment. Someone who had paid for the same place for 20 years felt strongly about that place, which meant disputes became more serious, not violent, but louder. Voices carried across the square, hands waved dramatically, accusations flew like startled pigeons, and occasionally the dispute required a special kind of court. A court designed specifically for markets, a court with a name that sounded slightly mysterious. The Court of Pie Powder. The name itself came from the dusty feet of traveling merchants, because markets attracted visitors from far away, people who arrived with dust on their boots. And when those visitors argued with local sellers, the dispute needed a quick solution. They could not wait weeks for a judge. They would be gone tomorrow. So the pie powder court solved problems immediately, sometimes within minutes. The judge listened. The crowd watched. A decision was made, and the market continued. Speed was more important than perfection. Now, not every space dispute involved courts. Many were solved through quieter methods. A neighbor might whisper advice. You should move slightly to the left. The butcher likes this corner. Or someone might offer compromise. Stand here today. Next week you take the other side. Markets were social systems. They functioned through conversation as much as law, and conversation often solved problems faster. But occasionally, the disputes produced strange traditions. Imagine a stall that had been occupied by the same seller for decades. Customers expected to find him there. His absence would confuse them. So when that seller died, something unusual happened. His son took the stall, or his daughter, or sometimes his apprentice, not because a rule required it, but because everyone assumed it should happen. The stall belonged to the family, which meant the market slowly developed something resembling inheritance, not of land, but of space. Invisible property, property made of habit, and habit is one of the strongest forces in medieval life. Over time, these habits reshaped entire markets. Temporary stalls became permanent structures. Wooden tables became stone counters. Canvas roofs became wooden awnings. And what had once been a scattered gathering of carts began to resemble a real marketplace. Still noisy, still chaotic, still slightly muddy, but no longer accidental. A system had quietly formed, a system nobody had designed, created simply by people returning to the same places, again and again, every morning, for centuries. If you stayed in a medieval market long enough, you would eventually begin to notice something that nobody seemed very eager to discuss. Things fell constantly, not dramatic things, not entire carts or barrels, but small things, pieces of cabbage leaf, drops of milk, fish scales that shimmered briefly in the sunlight before disappearing beneath someone's boot. Markets were places of movement, hands passing goods, knives cutting meat, customers inspecting fruit. And when things move constantly, things also fall constantly. At first, the ground of the market looked almost clean. Early morning dew sometimes softened the dust. The stones of the square still remembered the coolness of the night. But markets are patient. They build their environment slowly. One cabbage leaf, one onion skin, a splash of water from a fish barrel, a little straw shaken loose from a cart. None of these things mattered individually, but markets rarely deal in individuals. They deal in accumulation. Soon the ground began to change. A thin layer appeared, soft, uneven, a mixture of straw and vegetable scraps, sometimes damp, sometimes sticky, always temporary. Or, at least, that was the idea, because most medieval towns actually had rules about cleaning markets, very sensible rules. After the market ended, someone was supposed to sweep the square. Waste should be gathered, rotting food removed, everything made respectable again before the next market day. The rules sounded excellent, almost modern, but rules require effort, and effort requires someone willing to perform it, which was where the system became flexible, because sweeping an entire market square was unpleasant work, especially after a busy morning. Imagine the mixture: crushed fruit, broken eggs, bits of meat, straw soaked with fish water, and perhaps the occasional contribution from a passing horse. None of this smelled particularly inspiring, which meant the people responsible for cleaning sometimes developed shortcuts. A pile of waste might be moved to the edge of the square, which technically counted as cleaning. From there, the pile might be pushed into a nearby street, which technically counted as removal. Eventually, someone else might move it again, perhaps toward the river, perhaps toward a ditch, perhaps somewhere nobody particularly important would notice. In this way, the waste of the market slowly traveled through the city, not disappearing, just migrating. Cities tried many solutions. Some towns required sellers to remove their own waste, a perfectly logical idea, except sellers often forgot or pretended to forget. Other towns hired workers specifically to clean markets. These workers were known by many names: scavengers, sweepers, rakers. Their job was simple: remove whatever the market had left behind. But the scale of the task was impressive, because medieval markets were enthusiastic producers of debris. Consider the butcher's stall. Meat did not arrive neatly packaged. Animals were cut apart, bones trimmed, fat sliced away, and small pieces inevitably fell. Sometimes these pieces were gathered and sold cheaply, nothing wasted, but other fragments were less useful. Blood dripped onto the ground, warm at first, then darker, then sticky. Butchers often spread straw beneath their tables to absorb the mess. This was effective for a while, but eventually the straw itself became something else. A damp mat of blood and fat, which needed to be removed, or at least relocated. Fish stalls had their own contributions. Fish scales are fascinating objects, tiny, reflective, light enough to float briefly in the air. But when hundreds of fish are cleaned in one morning, the scales accumulate. They cling to boots. They settle between stones. They glitter briefly before becoming part of the ground. And then there were vegetables. Vegetables are polite foods, but even polite foods create debris. Outer cabbage leaves, pea pods, wilted herbs, all of them drifting slowly downward as the morning progressed. At first glance, this might sound unpleasant, and in some ways it was. But medieval people did not consider it unusual. Markets were living environments. Mess was expected. In fact, a completely clean market would have looked suspicious. Perhaps empty, perhaps unsuccessful. A certain amount of debris suggested activity. Food had moved. People had bought things. The city had eaten. Still, the smell could become ambitious, especially when the sun warmed the square. This was when town authorities remembered their cleaning rules again. Inspectors might appear. Complaints might be recorded. Someone might even be fined for leaving waste in the wrong place. But fines rarely eliminated the problem. They simply encouraged creativity. Waste could be hidden, covered with straw, moved slightly farther down the street, deposited discreetly near a drainage ditch. Medieval drains were remarkable inventions. They carried water away from streets. Unfortunately, they also carried many other things. Vegetable scraps, animal remains, fish bones, all traveling slowly through narrow channels beneath the city, which sometimes caused blockages. And when blockages occurred, the city experienced a very particular moment. The moment when the smell returned, stronger, more determined, as if the market itself had decided to revisit the square. Because markets never truly disappeared. Even after the stalls closed, even after the sellers left, even after the sweepers finished their work, traces remained. Small fragments of the morning, waiting quietly on the stones, until tomorrow, when the carts would return again, the fish, the milk, the onions, and once again, the first cabbage leaf would fall. If you listened carefully in a medieval market, beneath the shouting sellers, beneath the bargaining voices, beneath the steady murmur of coins and conversation, you could usually hear another set of opinions, very strong opinions. They belonged to the animals, because animals were everywhere in a medieval market, not just as food, but as participants, unwilling participants, in many cases, but present nonetheless. The first animals, of course, were the ones that brought the market itself. Horses pulling carts, donkeys carrying sacks, oxen moving slowly with the patience of creatures that understood the pace of medieval roads. These animals did not particularly care about markets. They cared about standing still, which was fortunate, because standing still was the majority of their work once the cart arrived. A horse might spend an hour simply waiting beside a stall, watching people move past, listening to unfamiliar sounds, occasionally turning its head to inspect a basket of vegetables that was just within reach. And if the horse managed to steal a cabbage leaf, this was considered a small victory. Animals were not the only opportunists in the market, but the animals being sold were far more interesting. Chickens arrived frequently, usually in wicker cages, sometimes tied together by the legs. Chickens did not enjoy markets. They complained about them constantly. Their voices rose above the crowd in sharp bursts of protest, clucking, flapping, occasionally achieving brief moments of escape. A chicken escaping in a crowded market is a surprisingly effective form of entertainment. Children chase it. Adults step aside. The seller runs through the square, apologizing loudly. Eventually, the chicken is captured again, often by someone who has no intention of helping but enjoys the excitement. Pigs were even more dramatic. Pigs possess strong opinions about movement. They prefer not to move, especially not toward unfamiliar locations, which meant that bringing a pig into the market often involved negotiation. The negotiation usually began with a rope. The rope was attached to the pig. The farmer pulled. The pig disagreed. This disagreement produced a sound that traveled extremely well across a crowded square. A squeal, loud, indignant, impossible to ignore. Everyone turned to watch, because pig negotiations were theatrical events. Eventually, the pig usually lost the argument, or, at least, became temporarily cooperative. And once inside the market, the pig became a spectacle. Customers examined it carefully, walking around it, discussing its weight, its health, its potential future as several different meals. The pig, meanwhile, considered other possibilities. Escape remained a popular idea. Now larger animals appeared less frequently. Cattle required space. Markets rarely had much of that, but occasionally a cow arrived, or even a small herd. These animals created immediate traffic complications. Cows move slowly, crowds do not, which meant someone was always shouting instructions. Move aside, watch your basket, careful with the milk. But cows were surprisingly calm. They moved through the chaos with quiet determination. Perhaps they sensed that resisting the crowd was pointless, or perhaps they simply accepted the strange journey. Markets also attracted animals that had no intention of being sold. Dogs. Dogs loved markets, not because of commerce, because of food. Markets were excellent places to find dropped scraps, a bone beneath the butcher's table, a piece of bread fallen near a stall, a forgotten crust near the fountain. Dogs developed impressive knowledge of market geography. They knew exactly where opportunities appeared. They waited patiently beneath tables, watched carefully, and when a piece of meat slipped from a cutting board, a dog could move with remarkable speed. Of course, sellers did not always appreciate this assistance. A butcher, discovering that his dog had stolen half a sausage, might respond with colorful language. But chasing dogs through a crowded market was rarely successful. Dogs were faster. Cats were also present. Cats were quieter, more professional. They had a specific assignment. Mice. Markets stored grain. Grain attracted mice, and mice attracted cats. A good market cat could live very comfortably. Warm corners, constant activity, occasional gifts of fish from friendly sellers. Although cats were also known to assist themselves without permission, fish stalls were particularly vulnerable. A moment of distraction, a fish left too close to the edge, and suddenly A cat was departing with impressive dignity, carrying the evidence. Most sellers accepted this with resignation, because a cat that stole fish also prevented mice, and mice were far worse thieves. Now, all these animals created something very important for the market: movement, constant movement, a cartwheel rolling forward, a chicken flapping between stools, a dog weaving through legs, a pig resisting progress with philosophical stubbornness. The market was not static, it flowed, a slow current of people and animals sharing the same narrow space. Occasionally this produced chaos. A horse might startle, a pig might pull away from its rope, a cage of chickens might fall over, and suddenly the quiet rhythm of trade transformed into brief confusion. But markets recovered quickly. People adjusted. Animals were caught again. Baskets were lifted. Coins continued changing hands. Because markets had learned a valuable lesson over centuries, perfect order was unnecessary. Life was messy. Animals disagreed with human plans, and the city continued functioning anyway. Every morning, with the same mixture of voices, smells, and creatures who had never agreed to attend the market in the first place. There was a moment in every medieval market morning when a subtle change moved through the crowd. Not a loud change, nothing dramatic, no bell ringing, no trumpet announcing authority. But the sellers noticed, the butchers noticed, the bread sellers noticed, even the fish sellers noticed, because someone had entered the square carrying scales. And scales, in a medieval market, meant something very specific. An official. Now officials did not arrive particularly early. They preferred a reasonable hour, early enough to appear responsible, but not so early that the cold morning air still belonged to farmers and carts. By the time the officials appeared, the market was already fully awake. Stalls arranged, customers bargaining, voices rising and falling across the square, which made their entrance much easier to observe. Officials had a certain look, not exactly wealthy, not exactly poor, but unmistakably official. A cloak that suggested authority, a pouch that suggested documents, and usually a small collection of tools, scales, metal weights, sometimes a measuring rod, sometimes a notebook. These objects had a purpose. Markets, you see, were not supposed to be chaotic places, at least not in theory. In theory, they were carefully regulated environments. Bread had to weigh a specific amount. Ale had to be sold at a specific price. Fish could not be dangerously old. Meat could not be suspiciously small. And all of this depended on one thing: measurement. The medieval world was deeply interested in measurement, perhaps because measurement was so difficult. Every town had its own traditions, its own standards, its own official weights, which meant that merchants travelling from one place to another sometimes experienced confusion. A pound in one city might feel slightly different in another. A bushel of grain might change personality depending on which market you visited. Authorities disliked this uncertainty, so inspectors carried official weights, heavy little pieces of metal, stamped with symbols, carefully preserved. When an inspector approached a stall, the market performed a small ritual. The seller smiled politely. The scale was placed on the table, and the inspector placed his weight on one side, bread on the other. Everyone watched. Customers, nearby sellers. Occasionally, a dog who was simply curious about the bread. If the bread balanced correctly, the seller relaxed. If the bread tipped upward, the inspector's eyebrow moved slightly. not dramatically, just enough to communicate disappointment. And disappointment could be expensive, because medieval cities had a wide collection of punishments for dishonest trade. Some punishments were simple: a fine, money paid to the city treasury. Cities enjoyed fines. Fines funded walls, roads, occasionally celebrations. But sometimes the punishment was more theatrical. Markets were public places, which meant public punishment was very effective. There was a device used in many towns, a wooden structure, uncomfortable, highly visible, the pillory. When someone cheated too boldly, too obviously, the pillory became involved. The offender's head and hands were locked into place, right there in the market square, for everyone to see, and everyone did see. Markets attract crowds. Crowds attract attention. Attention attracts opinions. Some people laughed. Some people shouted insults. Some people simply continued buying onions while observing the situation. Humiliation was considered educational. But interestingly, the pillory was not used every day. Authorities understood something important. Markets required sellers. If punishments were too frequent, too severe, sellers might decide to trade elsewhere, which would reduce the city's food supply and reduce the city's taxes. So enforcement followed a careful balance. Enough punishment to remind everyone of the rules, not enough to damage the market itself. Inspectors also watched for another problem, a problem that had existed since the earliest markets: buying and reselling. On the surface, this sounds harmless. A merchant buys goods, then sells them later. Perfectly ordinary. But medieval authorities believed this behavior could cause price problems. If someone bought all the grain early, then sold it later at a higher price, customers suffered. At least that was the theory. So certain types of reselling had special names: forestalling, regrating, engrossing. These words appeared in laws across many towns. They sounded serious, and sometimes they were. But proving these crimes was difficult. Merchants rarely confessed. Transactions happened quickly. Witnesses disagreed. And the market continued moving. Inspectors could watch. They could suspect. But suspicion was not always proof, which meant the system relied partly on reputation. A merchant known for dishonest tricks attracted attention. A merchant known for fair trade attracted customers. Markets developed memory, a kind of social record, invisible but powerful. Customers remembered good sellers. They remembered bad ones too. And over time, this memory became almost as important as the official rules, because trust was valuable, very valuable, more valuable than a single coin, more valuable than a single sale. Trust meant customers return next week, and the week after that, standing at the same stall, in the same corner, in the same crowded market square, where the officials continued their slow walk between stalls, scales in hand, watching, measuring, trying in their patient way to persuade the market to behave. A difficult task, but someone had to attempt it. If someone wanted to know what was happening in a medieval town, the fastest place to find out was rarely the church, and it was rarely the town hall. It was the market, because markets gathered something more powerful than authority. They gathered people, all kinds of people, farmers arriving from the countryside, craftsmen from workshops, servants from wealthy houses, travelling merchants, sailors passing through, and occasionally someone who had arrived from a town 2 days away. which meant the market was not only a place where vegetables moved, information moved as well, and information moved quickly, much faster than bread, much faster than carts, much faster than official announcements. The process usually began quietly. Two people speaking beside a stall, one of them leaning slightly closer, lowering their voice. Did you hear what happened near the northern road? Now, this question did not require a clear answer. In fact, the question itself was enough, because the moment it was asked, curiosity appeared. Someone nearby might turn their head. Another person might pause while examining apples. Soon, 3 people were listening, then 5. Because human beings are extremely talented at noticing secrets, and markets are excellent amplifiers of secrets. The person telling the story might not even know the entire truth, but truth is rarely required for a good market story. Details appeared quickly. A merchant robbed on the road, a tax collector arguing with a farmer, a local baker accused of watering his dough. Some stories were true, some were half true, some were entirely creative, but they all travelled from stall to stall, from customer to customer, spreading through the square like smoke from a cooking fire. Now, certain people became specialists in this process. They were not official messengers, but they functioned almost like newspapers. A blacksmith who spoke with travellers every day, a fish seller who heard stories from sailors arriving at the river docks, an innkeeper who listened to merchants late at night. These people carried news into the market, and once the news arrived, it rarely stayed quiet for long. Because markets were loud environments, even whispers could become public information within minutes. Imagine someone mentioning a rumour about taxes. A small rumour, nothing dramatic, just a suggestion that the town council might raise market fees. Immediately the sellers became interested. Taxes were a very popular subject of discussion. Everyone had an opinion. The butcher believed the city already demanded too much. The baker suspected the rumour was exaggerated. The fish seller was certain the rumour was entirely true and very unfair. Within half an hour, the entire square might be discussing the matter. Even people who had never heard the original rumour. Markets were remarkable engines of exaggeration. A small complaint could become a dramatic story by midday. But gossip did not only concern politics, it also concerned people. Because medieval towns were not large places, everyone knew someone who knew someone, which meant personal news travelled easily. A wedding planned, a merchant bankrupt, a soldier returning from war, a priest who had said something unusual during yesterday's sermon. All of this information appeared in the market. Sometimes shared intentionally, sometimes shared accidentally, and sometimes shared by people who were simply very enthusiastic about storytelling. The market also had another role. It served as a place where strangers could test information. Imagine a traveller arriving in town. He might not know the reputation of local sellers, but the market quickly revealed it. A whispered comment. That butcher cheats with his scales, or perhaps the opposite, that bread seller is honest. These small pieces of reputation shaped trade. Customers adjusted their choices. Sellers adjusted their behaviour. The market listened, remembered, and repeated the stories again the following week. Occasionally gossip even reached the ears of officials, which could produce interesting consequences. An inspector might suddenly appear at a stall that had been mentioned too often in rumours. A merchant might find himself questioned unexpectedly, not because of evidence, but because of conversation. Markets had power, not formal power, but social power, the ability to influence attention, the ability to create suspicion, the ability to reward or damage reputation, all through words. Words carried casually between baskets of onions and piles of cabbages. And while all of this talking continued, the practical work of the market never stopped. Coins still changed hands. Bread still sold. Milk still poured into wooden cups. The gossip floated above the trade like smoke above a fire, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, but always present, because markets were not silent places, not for smells, not for animals, and certainly not for stories. There was a moment in every medieval market day when the energy of the morning began to soften. Not suddenly. Markets did not end with a clear signal. No bell rang to announce that the excitement was finished. Instead, the change arrived slowly, almost lazily, like the way afternoon light stretches across a stone wall. At first, nothing seemed different. Voices still filled the square. Coins still changed hands. Customers still moved between stalls. But if you watched carefully, you could see the rhythm shifting. The earliest buyers had already gone home. The servants had returned to their kitchens. Cooks were stirring pots. Craftsmen had opened their workshops. The crowd that remained was different, slower, less urgent. People who had time to wander. People who enjoyed looking more than buying. And sellers noticed this change immediately, because sellers understand time very well, especially the time between profit and leftovers. In the morning, goods were confident. Fresh bread, bright vegetables, fish that still believed in the possibility of being eaten quickly. Prices reflected that confidence. But as the sun climbed higher, confidence began to fade. Bread cooled, herbs wilted slightly, fish developed opinions, which meant the sellers began adjusting their strategy. Very gently at first, a small price change. Nothing dramatic, just enough to encourage hesitation to become purchase. 2 for a coin, a seller might say. Instead of 3, customers noticed, but they did not hurry, because experienced customers understood the afternoon market. Afternoon was the hour of negotiation, the hour when patience could be rewarded. Imagine a woman standing beside a stall of apples. In the morning, those apples had been expensive, beautiful, carefully arranged. But now the seller had sold half the basket, and the remaining apples had begun to soften slightly in the warm air. Nothing serious, still perfectly edible, but no longer proud. The woman lifted one apple, turned it slowly in her hand, examined a small bruise. She said nothing. The seller said nothing. Silence is a powerful negotiating tool. Finally, the seller sighed. Take 2. The woman placed both apples into her basket. Coins changed hands, and both people believed they had succeeded. These quiet negotiations happened everywhere in the afternoon market. Not loud, not dramatic, just patient. The market slowly releasing its remaining goods. Some sellers had already begun packing, especially those who had been successful. An empty basket is a happy basket. A fish seller who sold everything early might already be washing the stall, pouring water across the stones, watching scales and scraps drift toward the edge of the square. But other sellers faced a different challenge. Unsold goods, food that could not return home, because tomorrow it might not be welcome. Milk could not wait another day. Fish definitely could not. Even vegetables had limits, which meant sellers became creative again. Bundles appeared. Take the onions with the cabbage. Take the herbs with the bread. Strange combinations formed. not because anyone wanted them, but because selling two things at once felt more hopeful than selling nothing. Customers understood this game. Some waited specifically for these offers. Late market bargains. A basket of slightly tired vegetables could feed a household perfectly well. At a lower price. Meanwhile, the noise of the square changed again. Morning shouting had become afternoon conversation. Sellers spoke with neighbours. Stories returned. News from earlier in the day. Rumours expanded. A group of craftsmen paused near the well, discussing something that had happened 2 streets away. A child chased a chicken that was no longer interesting to catch. A dog slept beneath a table. Even the animals seemed tired. Pigs rested quietly. Carts stood motionless. The city itself felt slower, because markets required energy, and energy fades with sunlight. Eventually, the square developed small, empty spaces. A stall removed. A cart departing. A patch of ground where vegetables had been piled earlier. The stones beneath began to reappear, and with them the evidence of the morning: straw, leaves, fish scales, a crushed apple, a dropped coin that someone would discover tomorrow. The market was not gone yet, but it was beginning to loosen, like a knot slowly untied. Sellers folded cloth awnings. Trestle tables were lifted. Ropes untied. Carts creaked back into motion. One by one they rolled away from the square, back through the streets, back toward farms, rivers, workshops, and houses where the day would continue in quieter ways. But something remained behind. A faint smell, a memory in the stones, the impression of footsteps, because tomorrow morning, before the sun had fully risen, the market would begin again, with the same carts, the same voices, the same onion seller standing in exactly the same place, waiting patiently for the first customer of another dawn. When the last cart finally rolled away from the market square, the place did not immediately become quiet. Silence rarely arrives all at once in a medieval town. Instead, the sounds faded slowly. One stall closing, another cart rattling toward a narrow street, a seller calling a final price that nobody answered. The market loosened its grip on the square piece by piece, until eventually only the space remained, the space where the market had been. At first, the square looked strangely large, without the carts, without the tables, without the crowded rows of baskets. The open ground felt unfamiliar, almost empty. But the emptiness did not last long, because the market always left evidence behind. The stones of the square held the memory of the morning. A line of straw where a butcher's stall had stood, a faint stain where fish barrels had rested, vegetable leaves scattered like quiet reminders of earlier arguments about prices. Even after the sellers had gone, the square continued telling their story. The smells lingered a little longer. Fish, milk, animals, and something else. Something that was difficult to name. The smell of a place that had been busy. Now the city itself began returning to its other routines. Shops along the edges of the square closed their shutters. Craftsmen finished the last hours of work. Children who had spent the afternoon chasing chickens were called home for supper. Dogs wandered through the quiet stalls, searching for forgotten scraps. And somewhere, a cat stepped carefully across the stones, inspecting the territory now that the crowds had disappeared. Cats always preferred the market after the market. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes a few people remained in the square, not sellers, not buyers, just residents passing through, perhaps someone walking home, perhaps someone sitting beside the fountain. Markets had a strange effect on places. Even when they ended, the sense of gathering remained, as if the square had absorbed the energy of the day. Now the sky began to change. The warm light of afternoon faded. Shadows stretched across the buildings, and slowly the evening arrived. Medieval towns did not stay awake late. Without bright lamps or busy nightlife, the streets grew quieter quickly. Shutters closed, doors locked, candles flickered inside houses, and the square returned to something close to its original state, but never completely, because the ground still held traces of the morning. A cabbage leaf near the well, a broken feather from a chicken cage, a small coin lost beneath a stone. Eventually, someone arrived with a broom, not always immediately, but eventually. Sweeping the square was one of those jobs that happened at the end of the day. When most people had already gone home, the broom moved slowly across the stones. Straw gathered into small piles. Vegetable scraps pushed toward the edge of the square. The work was not perfect. Markets produced too much debris for perfection, but the effort helped. Gradually, the square began to resemble an ordinary place again. A place where people crossed from one street to another. A place where children might play in the morning. A place where nothing unusual happened, except that everyone knew something unusual would happen tomorrow, because markets were predictable, not in detail, but in rhythm. The carts would return, farmers waking before dawn, fish sellers arriving early with barrels still dripping river water, milk carried carefully through the gates, and the onion seller standing in exactly the same corner he had chosen years ago. Perhaps decades ago, waiting. Markets depended on repetition, on familiar places, on familiar voices. Customers returned to the stalls they trusted. Sellers returned to the spaces they knew. Even the dogs and cats returned to their favorite corners. This repetition made the market feel permanent, even though every stall disappeared at the end of the day. Now the night deepened. The last footsteps faded. The curfew bell might ring somewhere in the distance, a reminder that the city was closing itself again. Gates would be shut, lanterns dimmed, the streets belonging briefly to quiet and darkness. But the square remained, empty now, patient, a stage waiting for the next performance. Because long before the sun returned, long before the first servant stepped through the streets carrying a basket, long before the first fish barrel opened, the square would already be expecting them. The market was not just an event, it was a habit. And habits, especially medieval habits, are very difficult to end. So the square slept lightly, knowing that tomorrow morning, in the grey hour before sunrise, the first cart would arrive again.